Here is a question to sit with for the next few minutes. If you were a child, starving, in the worst place human beings have ever built for each other, and your mother handed you the very last 2 pieces of food you owned in the world, what would you do with them? Now imagine you were also asked to give them away to a stranger. This is a true story about a girl who did exactly that, and about what came back to her decades later in a room full of people who had no idea what they were about to witness. Her name is Francine Christophe. She was born in France in 1933 into a Jewish family. Her father was a soldier, taken prisoner of war early in the conflict, and in July of 1942, Francine, 8 years old, and her mother were arrested while trying to cross into the unoccupied part of the country. Her father was somewhere in a POW camp in Lübeck, unable to help, unaware for years of exactly what was happening to his wife and daughter. What followed for Francine and her mother was a chain of French internment camps. Angoulême, then Drancy, the transit camp outside Paris that fed the deportation trains east. Then Pithiviers, then Beaune-la-Rolande, each one a waiting room for something worse. Eventually, they were deported to Bergen-Belsen in northern Germany, one of the camps whose name has become shorthand for the worst that period of history produced. By the time Francine and her mother arrived, the camp was already collapsing under its own cruelty. Overcrowding, starvation, and disease moving through the barracks faster than anyone could track. Typhus killed by the thousands. There was, by any ordinary standard, no more food to spare, no more medicine, no margin left for generosity of any kind. Francine's mother had managed to keep 2 small pieces of chocolate. That is the entire treasury. In a place where people were dying of starvation and disease by the thousands, this woman had rationed and hidden and protected 2 pieces of chocolate, meant for one purpose only, to give her daughter something on the day it might actually save her life. They didn't eat them, not out of hunger, not out of despair. They were saved. At the camp, there was a pregnant woman. Her name was Hélène, and she was so starved, so wasted by the conditions, that Francine's mother later said you could barely tell she was carrying a child at all. When Hélène went into labor, Francine's mother brought her to the camp's makeshift hospital, and then she came back to her daughter, and she asked her something almost impossible to ask an 8-year-old. "If it is all right with you," she said, "I'd like to bring your chocolate to this lady. Giving birth here will be hard. She may die. If I give her the chocolate, it may help her." Think about what is actually being asked in that sentence, not just for a piece of candy, for the only reserve of strength this family had left, for a stranger who might not even survive to use it. Francine said yes. The chocolate went to Hélène, and in that camp hospital, in the middle of Bergen-Belsen, she gave birth to a tiny infant girl who came into the world in near total silence. No cry, nothing. Francine, 8 years old, was there to see it happen. The baby did not make a sound for 6 months. Through the rest of that winter, through the worst of the camp, silence. It wasn't until the camp was finally liberated, Soviet forces reached them at Trobitz in April of 1945, that the child, at last, cried out loud for the first time. Francine would say later that that cry was the baby's real birth. The first one had been too quiet, even to count. If a mother asking her starving 8-year-old to give away the last food they owned for a stranger is already more than you expected from this story, take a second and hit that like button. It tells me these are the stories worth telling with the weight they deserve. And subscribe, because what happened decades later is the reason this story is still being told at all. Stay with me, because we still haven't answered the question we opened with. Francine survived the war. Her father survived his prison camp too, and the family was eventually reunited, one of the rarer outcomes of that period, and not one Francine ever took for granted. But she did not simply move on and try to forget, the way many survivors of her generation were quietly encouraged to. She spent much of the rest of her life doing something remarkable with what she'd lived through. She wrote books, recording her own testimony and the testimony of other former deportees. She lectured for decades in French schools, so the details would not soften into vague, safe history. And she became an advocate and organizer for survivor associations, working on behalf of the people who had shared her camps and her losses. Among the work she took on was organizing conferences specifically on the long psychological aftermath of the camps, the part of the story that ends officially at liberation, but never actually ends for the people who lived it. At one of those conferences, decades after Bergen-Belsen, in a room full of professionals there to discuss trauma and survival in the clinical, careful language of people who study these things, a woman stood up to speak. She was scheduled as one of the presenters, a psychiatrist. Nobody in that room knew her personal history, and instead of opening with her credentials, she walked to the podium, reached into her pocket, and pulled out a single piece of chocolate. She held it out toward Francine. "I am the baby," she said. The infant born in silence in a concentration camp hospital, the one who did not cry for 6 months, the one whose life may have been saved by 2 pieces of chocolate an 8-year-old girl agreed to give away, had grown up. Trained as a doctor, spent her career helping people survive what could not be survived alone. And she had carried a piece of chocolate in her pocket for the day she might finally meet the girl who gave hers away. So, the question from the beginning: what do you do with the last thing you own in the worst place on earth? Francine Christophe's answer was, you give it away to save someone you don't even know. And more than half a century later, in a room that had nothing to do with chocolate or camps or children, that answer walked up to a podium, alive, and said thank you in the only language that could possibly carry it. If you want more stories like this one, real, forgotten, hidden in the details the official version leaves out, watch the video already coming up on your screen right now. Here on It Sounds Like Fiction, but it's history, there's always one more secret waiting.